Hi, and welcome to part 19 of the Major Arcana series of Crowley's Taught Tarot. Today we are talking about the moon. Okay, the moon. A lot of interesting stuff to talk about here. As always, there's always interesting stuff to talk about with all of these. This is the path that is of the sign Pisces. It is the last of the astrological trumps. Meaning that it's the last of the trumps that represent a sign of the zodiac. There is still the sun yet, which represents the sun. So there are two more planetary trumps, but I don't consider them astrological only because when I think of astrology, I think of the signs specifically, and I'm sure there are astrology people out there who would take issue with that. But but for my intents and purposes, I consider this the last of the astrological trumps. So being such, either way, it does represent the last sign of the zodiac, and really it represents a major transition as a result. It does represent this kind of boundary and almost liminality. Liminality is one of my favorite words because I think it is incredibly useful a word. When talking about, and of course this is going back to Victor Turner's model of liminality, I'm a big fan of it. The idea of liminality is essentially that the farther from normalcy you go, physically and mentally, the more prone to a spiritual experience you are. So of course lust, the idea of the lust card is very much based on that. But so is this one. The moon is very similar in that it represents the bizarre and the general unknown. And so it comes across as a very scary card. It comes across as a card that represents a lot of muck that we don't necessarily like. It's a card associated with fear, of course, but primarily illusion. Illusion is very much the key word of this trump. Because it is the moon in title only. Otherwise, it is the sign of Pisces, as we talked about. And Pisces is a sign very much associated with the subconscious, with intuitive gifts, with the emotions, particularly. Pisceans are very emotive people and are usually very artistic people. So this card represents the process, essentially, of delving into the subconscious and weeding through its backwater, so to speak. As we can see on the card itself, it's blue quality, and the wave kind of pattern on the bottom does have this water-like aspect to it. And of course, if we think of the Waite image, or rather the Pamela Coleman Smith image of this card, which is very similar to the Marseille Tarot image, the two towers and the two dogs or animals, and the crustacean coming out of this kind of pool in the foreground of the card. And so the card is very much about water being a symbol of that subconscious depth of the personality. So essentially, but at the same time, it is a card that is very much associated with the sun, because of course we have the sun right here, kind of a no-brainer, being pushed by the god Kefra as a beetle, and the god Kefra was responsible for rolling the solar disk of the sun god across the sky. So Kefra essentially is the sun god in one of his multiple incarnations in Egyptian mythology. But so this card is this idea of the sun being contained in that subconscious void almost. That the depths of the subconscious contain that light of truth that causative light of reason and purpose and divinity. That is the foundation of all the other stuff that appears to be chaotic and nonsensical, and which is all about illusion. Basically, the idea is, of course, that the solar self, or the self intificate on the Tree of Life, is the self, that the part of our consciousness that is very much concealed, but not as concealed as Keter, that is the basis for our experiences. It is the center of our true will, and as such, it is responsible for mediating the events that happen to us. Now, of course, living under the sway of the moon, so to speak, we like to see the world around us as meaningless, essentially, in a bad way. I think, for me, I see this card as kind of coming full circle, but not in a good way, from the Fool, because the Fool teaches us that there is no inherent meaning of life, and that's why life is bliss. And existence is the only purpose of existence is bliss. And that's a beautiful thing. I mean, there's a profundity to the Fool's meaninglessness. Whereas the moon, because it's so illusionary, the moon has the perspective, or a person under the influence of the moon, Trump, essentially is under the assumption that life is totally random, that life is not interconnected, that life has no purpose and is therefore incredibly bleak. That there is no real, that individual is not feeling the connection to the deeper source of life within. And as such, they become very grounded in, I suppose the best word for it is sin. If we remember, this card is opposite the Hermit, and so it's similar to it but different. It is also the fulfillment of the Hermit, in other words. And the Hermit, if you remember the picture of the Hermit, has Cerberus with him. And of course, we talked about how the Hermit is responsible for descending into hell in order to redeem basically the pure essence that is trapped there. The Hermit is a psychopomp-like figure because he represents Mercury. He represents the will of God, and the will of God particularly in its function as a guide, as a secretive guide, as a subtle teacher, and as the essence that is responsible for our spiritual maturity as divine beings, basically. That the path of the true will, and of course the Chariot talks a little bit about this too, but that the path of the true will really is what it's all about and is the guideline for our development. Whereas the moon, and talking about all that hell stuff, and how, the Hermit has to, basically is a card of redemption. The moon represents that which needs redeeming. The moon is the image of hell, essentially. At least I see it as that. I see the moon being as the Crowleyan representation, or the tarot representation of what hell is. And it is a state of consciousness. It is a state of mind in which ignorance is predominant, and you are swayed by your lower senses, essentially. The connection to animals that this card has is there for a reason. The idea, even in the Book of the Law, it says, is God to live in a dog? Of course not. The idea is that God, one cannot recognize the presence of the divine within themselves if they are subject to their lower senses. In other words, they take everything for granted. They just see reality as what they think it is based on their eyes, based on their five senses. And they do not look for the greater patterns that exist behind the fabric of life that are actually the ones causing, the influences causing the fabric of life, which is that solar essence in each of us that connects us and readjusts all of our interactions with each other and our interactions with ourselves too. Quick addendum. I did not mean to say that, this is not to say that God does not exist in a literal dog. By dog, it is meant metaphorically, and of course just an individual who thinks like a dog and is not necessarily literally a dog. Of course, God permeates all things. Any subjective point of consciousness is a hadith and is therefore a God living in something. But of course, you know how I meant it. Okay. This is a very false image of the way the world works. Of course, being a feminine card, it is connected to the idea of Nuit. We talked about Nuit quite a bit in the last video on the star, and how the star is a representation of Nuit in her purity, and how the individual is almost a mini Nuit, that is that Orphic egg that the hermit is busy adoring in his card. So in this is more the bad side of the star. This is the idea that the body of Nuit, again, is dark. Instead of glimmering with stars, and instead of being infused with this magical essence that the star teaches us the universe is based on, the moon does not see that at all. And so the moon represents stagnation. The moon is called the witching moon, or this card is called the witching moon, and it's associated with the negative aspect of the feminine. Also on this card that is really worth talking about is the presence, or the obvious presence, of Anubis in two forms. Of course, we have one on each side of the card, and he is holding an ankh in each hand. The second one over here on the right is a little bit different, and we'll talk about that. But this reminds us of that connection to the hermit. Anubis is the psychopomp god of Egyptian mythology, and Anubis was in late Greco-Roman times was often conflated with Hermes. Actually, there is a god, as we talked about, I believe, with the Wheel of Fortune. We talked about Hermanubis, and how that was a combination of the god Anubis and Hermes, a god's Anubis and Hermes, that they both represent on one level the same thing, and that is to act as a guide for the souls of the dead. So this card, in that light, we talked at the beginning about how the card is a card of transition. It really does represent the transition from death into life. The idea of ignorance being death and stagnation, and life being everything that is not. That life is moving, that life is fertile, life is active, life is based on the true will of the individual. So that's what I think we're getting at with this. Definitely, this is the stagnant womb, essentially, or symbol of the feminine that, as long as it is not acted upon, becomes stagnant and therefore becomes associated with death. Whereas the masculine is always going to be associated with activity. I think that's the thing, that femininity does not, or rather, the sacred feminine requires something to act upon it. And this is where we get that dichotomy between Nuit and Hadith. Both of them are God. Both of them are a very necessary aspect of what the idea of God is about. But the idea is that Nuit is only so capable, essentially, that a point of consciousness, a hadit, so to speak, is required. Otherwise, that potential is always going to remain nebulous potential and won't ever become anything. And that's kind of what the moon is also talking about in regards to our subconscious. If we choose not to ever delve into it, if we choose to ignore it and remain scared by it and just don't want to touch it, then it will grow stagnant and it will become a redundant appenditure as opposed to a really productive or potentially productive aspect of our consciousness. So it does require that hermit-like plowing of the field, so to speak, in order to reap the subconscious's benefits. It does require the phallic seed of divine inspiration, of the true will, to really plumb the depths of that subconscious in order to find the truth that lies behind it. Right. So I don't believe I have anything else to say about this. The symbols that the Anubis representations are holding. This one, of course, on the left is an Ankh, just a plain old Ankh, if you can see it. Right? Fine and dandy. And then this, on the other hand, is very similar, but it has that very obvious line going right through the middle of it. I believe, I would say that we can easily look at the first one as either being, the crux ansata, which is essentially the symbol of Venus, or we can see it because it's got those little horns, sort of. I know it's the handle, but if you look at it, it still looks like the symbol for Mercury, which still makes sense either way. But what about this symbol? This symbol, I would say, is supposed to be Neptune, the symbol for Neptune, which, of course, is repeated here. Sorry, I never know how to go back and forth with this thing. The yods that are dripping from the moon are in the shape of this kind of pitchfork, like Neptune. But Neptune also has what is supposed to be this little line that goes through here. Of course, we don't have that, but we have it on this one. We've got the regular Ankh, so we've got the line in the bottom, but then we also have created on top the prongs of Neptune's trident. So, what is the point of that? I think it is a way of expressing the basic tenet of the Book of the Law, which is love is the law, love under will. Because if we say that this is, let's just say that this is meant to be just the Ankh, which is a symbol of, Venus, and that the total sum of the universe is love. Then we have love versus Neptune. And Neptune, actually, oddly enough, is a planet associated with Chokhmah, which is the father, which is essentially the force and vigor of, or it is the zeal of the Lord of Hosts, so to speak, of the individual's purpose. I think it's very easy to see Chokhmah as a kind of logos. And so in that case, and of course Pisces is ruled by Neptune, so that's why Neptune is here in the first place. But Neptune being a connection to that logos, I mean, in conjunction with Venus on the opposite end, and in the hands of the psychopomp Anubis, we really, I think, we have the symbol of love as the law, love under will, and that is the method by which one basically gets through all this. The idea of the two towers of abomination on the sides, and this little path that goes through them, like as with the traditional image of this card. The idea of that path being tread or followed by adhering to that basic principle, that in some ways that the process of attainment is one of choosing it in the first place, because attainment is really about love. It's about this whole process of delving into the subconscious is about eventually trying to unify the sense of self, which is, in essence, love. You know, love is a magnetizing, cohesive idea. And so it makes sense for that philosophy to be present on this card. Okay, that's about it for that one. Only three more. Wow, gosh. Three more cards, and then we'll be done with this series. Okay, so if you have any questions, comments, things you want to add, please by all means do so. And don't forget to like the video. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.